Hi, Ecclesia. Welcome to our series with Advent Conspiracy around the season of Advent. This is our second week talking about the themes of Advent. Today, we're going to be talking about spend less.
So, you may be asking, why spend less, Alexandra?
I think one of the questions I love around this conversation is, why do we spend? I feel like throughout the year, we kind of spend a typical amount, and then Christmas comes and we spend more. We spend more on whether that's for presents, decorations, things to wrap presents in, holiday cards, holiday clothing, events. There's so many things that come with this season that we end up spending more on than we typically do. And so this tenet kind of goes against the grain of our culture of wanting us to spend more than this time, to asking, why do we spend less as a part of Advent? What is about Advent that invites us to spend less?
I think sometimes as we actually don't necessarily consider Advent. We're just thinking about Christmas, and we're thinking about Christmas morning, and we're thinking about those gifts. And yet Advent is a season of anticipation, of waiting. And what are we waiting for? We're waiting for the birth of we're waiting for the celebration of the birth of Jesus, our liberating King. And I think one thing we're asking of ourselves and of our community is to think less of the spending and the stuff and more about that anticipation. And maybe through spending less, we can pause and plan and reconsider what all these things really mean, instead of being on autopilot. You know, this idea of everyone's heard of mindful eating versus mindless eating. And what happens when you mindlessly eat? You end up eating food that you don't need because you're not even hungry anymore. And I think with mindless spending, we end up spending on things maybe because we've done it in the past, or everybody else is doing it, but it's not really intentional, and it's certainly not connected to Advent, the celebration of Jesus.
Yeah, what I hear in a lot of what you're saying is being more mindful, of slowing down, of being more intentional. And I think that can go towards any number of the aspects of whether that's gifts, whether that's the events that we're saying yes to in this season, the time we're spending, the decorations or clothing that we're purchasing. I think a lot of that can still be distilled down to slowing down from the thought to the action and being more intentional and mindful and thoughtful in that space. And I think with this practice of spending less, it doesn't necessarily mean giving less. It just perhaps means giving in different ways. Perhaps having more curiosity around the people that we're giving to.
You had some really good, just personal experiences of ways that you yourself or others have spent less, but with greater meaning almost.
Yeah, I think one of the, in my childhood, my parents kind of kept us flexible, I would say, around our spending, because some years we would get one big gift and that was kind of it, or we would get a couple small gifts, or some years my parents would be like, here's some money for you to give away. And so the Christmas wasn't the same year after year for our family. And so in that way, it built in a lot of flexibility around what, it didn't tie the cost or amount of gifts to Christmas, but rather the act of generosity. And so sometimes we would spend less on purpose for that. I know as my family transitioned from like cousins and kids to being adult cousins, that there are conversations of like, oh, I don't know if we're going to buy presents for every single aunt and uncle, every single cousin, as everyone's becoming like adults, going to college, getting jobs. How do we rework that tradition as a family? Because I think a lot of our spending is tied to family dynamics, and how does that work? And so I have two different examples from two different sides of our family. One, the cousins live all over, and so we don't really gather together anymore, but we still wanted to kind of in that transition season offer a gift. And so we drew names from a hat. And so instead of buying for everyone, we drew for one person, and there was an intentional gift that they had requested. And so we said, okay, tell us your requests and we'll have a cap so everyone gets at least one gift. And then another side of our family gathers together somewhat more regularly. And so we had something similar, but we did more of a white elephant style. So we had a cap on spending, but then we each kind of got a gift and came not knowing what other people had brought. And we played a game with it. And so we kind of created two different versions of a tradition in that transition season that allowed us to spend less, but to give more intentionally and even spend more intentional time together around celebrating.
Yeah, as you were talking, it reminded me of when in my own family, the kids like made that transition to adults. And my mom loves to give gifts. It is almost her spiritual gift and her love language. And we had told her, Mom, we don't need any gifts. Like, we're fine. We have everything we need. We weren't even living in the house anymore. Well, it really kind of crushed her to hear that. And so what we've come around is, we don't want to tell people spend nothing, but we want to encourage spending less. And so my mom gives us all little stocking stuffers. And sometimes they're similar, but sometimes they're different. Different from my brother, from me, from my sister. And so it still allows her the joy of giving, but she is spending less because she's not getting this big gift for us and, some stocking stuffer. But it's just that small thing because she also enjoys shopping. And she does like to shop with intentionality. So we're not saying stop spending, but maybe just do it in a different, more thoughtful way.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on something that we cannot control the entirety of our experiences around this season. Perhaps you might be in a position to recommend a shift in tradition within your smaller family, within maybe your larger extended family, but maybe that isn't where your family is at in this season. And so I think you had another story of what people may do on kind of the back end of this season that could also be a part of spending less or being more intentional with where our things are going.
And this is sort of a preview for something later coming called Give More. But I have a friend, and from the time she and her sisters were babies, their family wanted to be intentional about Christmas. This is like way before Advent Conspiracy. And they decided that every year the girls would open their gifts and then choose 3 of them to give to the Star of Hope mission. And so they can't control all the things that people are giving. You can tell people, oh, do this instead of that. But, sometimes people are going to do what they're going to do. But for these girls, they learned that Christmas is about getting gifts, but it's also about giving. And so they would carefully choose like which gifts they wanted to give to Star of Hope mission. And I imagine that they're doing that with their own children now. And I think that leads us into just more conversation about what are those practical things that people can do. And you mentioned spending money on Christmas means all of these categories, right? And perhaps a family, like this could be new for them. They're like, oh my gosh, this sounds great, but turning the ship is going to be so difficult. Maybe of those 5 categories, like let's cut back on one category this year and then maybe cut back on another category another year. I think that's something practical people can do. Or spend less on yourself right now. Maybe don't go out for that meal so that you have more to give to others. Were there other things that you had thought of practically for people?
There was one, I think at Ecclesia, we talk about like our time, talents, and resources. And I think that's the image that I see in my head of like, we're spending more typically at Christmas. And so how do we spend less? And there's still a gap there perhaps that can be filled with either more intentionality or more creativity. I know intentionality, my brother, one Christmas asked family members, like, instead of getting me something new, would you get me a book or even the same book that has meant a lot to you? Because then that invited that family member to form a relational connection that had intentionality, but it was also really creative to say, I love something from you that I can now start a conversation with you after this. And so you didn't have to spend a lot on that, especially if you already had the book. But another, my brother's wife, she has a gift with sewing, and she had leftover fabric and zippers from previous projects that she had done. And so for Christmas, she made like a cloth pouch. And it's something that I'd actually been looking for. And I don't know if she knew that, but if she did, this was perfect because it was a pouch that she made. And so I use it actually every day. And it's a gift that whenever I use it, I think of her. And she didn't spend a lot of money on it, but she spent a lot of her time and her talents to create that kind of a gift. And so getting creative with what are the time and talents that are available to you that you could give as a gift to somebody, especially with getting more curious about what would make this person feel loved, because I think that's kind of the root of what we're talking about is how do we express love well? And it doesn't always have to be through a lot of money. It can be through our intentionality, our time, and our talents.
And all of that requires a pause.
Yes.
We don't get to autopilot it. That's not going to be fruitful in spending less. And, a suggestion we had talked about is to really consider a person that you're wanting to get a gift for. Maybe ask the Holy Spirit, help me see this person. What is it that would be meaningful to them? And I know there are people in my life, I could get them $1,000 gift, and it would be so much less meaningful than if I gave them an hour or two of my time and took them out for coffee. And I think that's another thing. People, we're busy right now. And so to give someone your time, that could be a really incredibly meaningful gift too. I think our time, speaking of, is probably up about now. And so, Ecclesia, our sisters, brothers, our friends and family, thanks for listening to this brief conversation. And we would want you to take some time and think about some of these things that we've talked about. How can the practice of spending less help you in this Advent season of anticipating the birth of our liberating King? We love you.